So I want to make a confession right at the front. I tried to cut a lot of things, but all of the amazing conversations that, where I have far too long a presentation. The reason is all of the things that you've been sharing has been prompting me to share things. But I want to give you one assurance. I'm going to skip a few things as time I watch time meander and as I see your reaction. And so don't worry if you're missing some slides. And also don't worry if you don't catch some of the things that I'm saying, because what I've realized is that most of what I'm going to say, you already know. You know with your heart and you know with your hands. I'm just saying another way, or I'm articulating them, using different words to say the same thing. So much of what I'm going to talk about this morning is something that you within the L'Arche community already know, but the world doesn't know. And one of the things I think that I and many of the people that are here, that are visitors also, are trying to do is to articulate the things so that someone out there that hasn't had the experience that you've had can understand. So just when excuse me, that isn't the truck that I drove down to Port Credit, but it's for those of you who have grown up on a farm, it's also not a combine, that's called a swather. So that's me when I was 12 on the swather. But now what I do is I run something called the Inclusive Design Research Center, which I started back in 1993. So can anybody do the math? You're 50 years old. My center is now 26 years old. So we've been going since we're about half your age, so we're a young one. And the reason I started this thing was to make sure that at the very, very beginning, from the very beginning, all those new things that are emerging, those new technologies that are changing our lives, are going to work for everyone, that they don't exclude people. And one thing to know about the Inclusive Design Research Center, everything we do is what we call open. That means it's free. You don't have to pay for it. In fact, you can take it and sell it if you want. So you can go to our site, and we have tools, we have resources, we have writing, we have videos, we have many, many things that we're hoping other people can use to help in this task of making sure that people understand the message that we've been trying to give and that you're trying to give. And we have partners all over the world. We love to collaborate, and we invite you to help us because it's a huge task. And these are just some pictures of some of our community events. I also started a graduate program, so for those of you that want to study this area, we have an academic program. But Pamela yesterday was talking about being a skeptical optimist, and that made me think, oh, what kind of optimist am I? Because I'm certainly an optimist. And so what I decided to tell you about is my journey from being a hopeful optimist to an alarmed optimist, and possibly back again. And I want to show you a historical item, which is a video that I created at something like this about 10 years ago, which shows you how optimistic I used to be. Then I will take you through some of the alarm that has happened, but hopefully we'll get through that and come back to optimism. So this is something that I created very, very quickly at a workshop.
Eeny, meeny, miny, moe, catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe.
I'm Jutta Treviranus, and I've come to wonder whether we have a chance to reorganize our future. David Kelly says that the future of design is human-centered. Most experts agree. That leaves the question, which human? An inevitable human condition is diversity. There's no typical human. Even clones and identical twins are not the same. We differ from one to the next, but also from one moment to the next, from one context to the next. But diversity and difference become overwhelming, and we develop strategies to deal with this diversity. We try to make things simpler, less complex, less chaotic. Another part of the human condition is that we try to find commonality and connections. We form groups, informal and formal, with implicit and explicit criteria. We organize, we create categories, we filter, we label. At our most insecure and overwhelmed, we divide in two, we create binaries. Male, female, disabled, normal, left, right, us, them. This all results in issues of who belongs and who is excluded. Membership in groups can be self-assigned, may be imposed, may even be policed. Groups are used to assert or assign privileges and powers. We use groups to judge. Values get assigned to groups. Often characteristics that have nothing to do with the original founding properties of groups are generalized to all individuals in the group. Sometimes people who are in an imposed group take ownership of the group and reform the classifications and values from within. Occasionally, someone has the audacity to break out of the category we have put her in, but to preserve our category, we may dismiss her as an anomaly. Some groups are more fluid, while others are more fixed. We not only form groups, but groups of groups, and groups of groups of groups. Membership in one group can grant us membership in other groups. But despite all this, we are diverse, we are complex, we are chaotic. Individually, we're different over time in different contexts and different roles in different groups. We need to assert our uniqueness. We need to form and refine our identity. We struggle with the identity imposed on us. Generally, people do not fit easily into assigned categories, and yet we persist in assigning them. And then, something new comes along and shakes up our groups, our categories, and our rules, and we need to adjust, rebuild, and rethink. Something like networks and digital stuff. This new digital and connected world puts into question how we group things and challenges our excuses for leaving people out. The digital changes our view of time, space, and distance, and by extension, our view of design, what is possible, and what things cost. Digital things are plastic, mutable, malleable, and adaptable. Before, not everyone could fit. Allowing someone in meant someone else was left out. In the digital, room is very stretchy. Before, what we created could not fit everyone, so we made it fit the largest group. We made it for the group called average or typical. This left out everyone not average or typical. In the digital reality, the things we make can reconfigure, adapt, and take a form that is best for each individual. In the solid world, each copy cost almost the same as the original. Consumption actually consumed. In the digital world, we can copy almost without cost. Consumption no longer consumes. Before, it took a great deal of time and effort to deliver things, especially to people far away. Now it is as easy to deliver things around the world as it is to deliver things next door. Before, if we didn't place things in a fixed spot, we would have a hard time finding them again. Now we can place them anywhere on the network and retrieve them from anywhere on the network. Before, we needed to label things unambiguously and simply so we could recognize them and know what to do with them. Now we can see a description of each person or thing that is useful and relevant to our purpose. And by the way, we have learned that inclusion and equality are good for all of us. We are all healthier, wealthier, and wiser when our society is inclusive and equal. We've also discovered that diverse groups are more innovative and creative and better at planning and predicting. We've experimented with new organization like most popular, to be ignored, friend, not friend. But we can do better. We can afford to be generous in our design. We have fewer excuses to exclude. We can be true to our diversity. perhaps now we can find a way to make room for us all.
Okay, the intention was to show my optimism, and okay. But of course, the last part of that was the very, very optimistic picture of what was happening, right? And that was about 10 years ago. And now I want to tell you another story, which is the story of my alarm. And don't worry, I'll take us back, hopefully, to optimism at the end. But one of the things we do with our center is we help governments and companies to decide how they're going to design things, policies and services. And one of the groups that we helped was the Ontario Ministry of Transportation. They had their 100th anniversary, and they wanted to know how they were going to deal with automated vehicles. That means those self-driving cars, those cars that have nobody sitting in the seat, but the car drives itself. And how they work is they use what's called a learning model, or a computer that has learned what you need to do in different situations and makes the decisions for people, or for the car in this instance. And what they allowed us to play with, or they allowed me to play with, was 6 of these computers that were going to tell a car when it came to an intersection whether to stop, whether to change direction, or whether to go through the intersection. And I have a good friend, Annie, and she pushes her wheelchair backwards. And I thought, that's a good way to test this thing. What will the cars do when they encounter Annie in the intersection? And Annie has very, very strong legs. She can't stand, but she's very efficient and effective in getting through intersections by herself. She's very fast. But people that encounter her in the intersection think she's lost control, and often they'll mistake the direction she wants to go in, and they'll grab her and push her back to the curb where she came from. So she has to try again. And unfortunately, Annie also doesn't speak, and her communication board is back in the thing. So it's something else to watch her try to get across an intersection when there's a lot of helpful people. And I thought, what is going to happen with Annie when she approaches an intersection? Will the cars know what to do? And unfortunately, what happened was they all decided, all of these 6 models that were going to be telling cars what to do in intersections, to run her over. They didn't stop when she came into the intersection. But they all said, oh, wait, these are not very smart models yet. We haven't given them enough data. They haven't learned enough. We need to tell them more and show them more about what wheelchairs, or what someone in a wheelchair does in an intersection. And so they said, come back when we've trained them with this data. And so I came back a few weeks later when they had added all sorts of data from all sorts of intersections that showed what a number of people in wheelchairs going through intersections. And I thought, oh good, okay, these are smarter systems. Hopefully they'll do something better. But what actually happened was, can anyone guess what? Well, some of you have heard this story before, but basically what they decided was they would run her over with greater confidence. Because they were confident, they thought they knew now that a typical wheelchair goes forward, it doesn't go backwards. Someone in a wheelchair is pushing forwards, not backwards. And so that started my alarm. And I realized that it's more than about automated vehicles. It's more than about the decisions or the machines that we use to make decisions for us with cars. It's happening with all those machines that are making decisions for us. All of them are following the same pattern. I went and I looked at banks that use machines to decide who gets a loan, who gets credit, insurance company that decides who gets insurance, human resources or people that are hiring that use machines to select from, say, 100 applications to decide who is going to get an interview. A lot of these systems are starting to turn the decisions over to machines, and those machines are following the same pattern. They're not dealing with people like my friend Annie. But then I also recognized it's more than about artificial intelligence. Some of the stuff I did was I looked back when in the 80s, before I started the center. I had created a system that was a communication system for people that have dysarthric speech. That means their speech, and they had repeatable dysarthric speech, meaning they said the things the same way every time, and their family and their friends understood them very well, but strangers couldn't understand them. So I was trying to teach the computers to recognize many of the things that they were saying. And what I looked at is those files, and I tried them with today's computers, which were much smarter, which had much more data, and I realized that today's smarter computers were actually not able to recognize my friend's speech, because their speech models, or what the computer knew about their speech, was overwhelmed by the majority. And it was very, very difficult for them to move and reteach those machines how to recognize their speech. And this started a group of people around the world that started to recognize that there is a bias in these machines, that they are misleaded in some way and they are not thinking straight. So we started to look at what are all of the different forms of bias, and there's a huge community now that is looking at biases that affect not just people with disabilities, but people who are Black, people who whose speech is different, who speak a different language, and a whole range of individuals that aren't where there isn't data about them, or where the human rules that guide the machines have brought in bias. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but what I realized, though, was even when all of that huge community had thought about how are we going to address this problem of what's called algorithmic bias, that means the rules are biased, they're in favor of one group and not another. And even when everybody is represented in the data and we have data about everybody, it's still not going to solve the problem of my friend Annie, because we have a major flaw in these machines. They're unable to handle diversity and complexity. They're unprepared for the unexpected, and they replicate our own inadequacies, though. And here I'm talking about us as researchers and us as academics. But the difficulty with the machines is that they automate and amplify them. And let me explain. So if I were to take, say, a survey, and I asked all of you, what are your needs in a whole bunch of different areas? And then I was to do something that we professors and researchers do when we create statistics, and I plotted on what we call a multivariate scatter plot. Don't worry about the name. It basically means that we position all of the needs in a number of different lines. So at one end would be, I need this, and in another end there would be the opposite thing that I need. What it would look like is a starburst. And professors call this a normal distribution. There's lots of different names for it. And what you would notice is that right in the middle, there's a whole bunch of dots that are clustered together. They're very close together. And those are about 80% of the dots, the needs that are there. And then spreading out from there would be a whole bunch of other dots, but only about 20%. And the thing to note is that those 20%, or the ones remaining, are spread further and further apart. The further away you get from the middle, the further apart you spread. And so that means that those dots in the middle are very similar to each other. They have very similar needs. But as you move away from the middle, your needs become more and more different. And this pattern happens in very, very many things. And one of the things that happens in my area, design, is that because of this pattern, because this is what we call a phenomenon that happens everywhere, things are designed for that group there in the middle, and design works for that group in the middle. As you move away from the needs that are in the middle, the design becomes more difficult. And as you get to that edge, and if you have a need that is out at that edge, design usually doesn't work. And this pattern is not just a pattern that happens when we're designing. It's something that happens in almost all of our different parts of life. What you find, and I don't know if people have been reading the news and hearing about disparity or inequality. Disparity basically means that we are creating haves and have-nots. And what the haves have is growing bigger and bigger, and what the have-nots have is getting less and less. And so this is what happens with design. If you are out in that periphery, most things are a misfit for you. They're not made for you. And if you're in the middle, they usually fit and they usually work well. And within the digital space, or with the internet and computers, there is something called Moore's Law, meaning they're getting faster and smaller and cheaper all the time. But that's the case if you're in that middle. It's not the case if you're out at the edge. In fact, what we're finding is that if you are out at the edge, then the things are getting more expensive, they're getting less available, training and maintenance, fixing them is becoming harder, and so that as well is causing what we call digital exclusion. But what I find most heartbreaking as a professor and an academic and a researcher is that this affects our knowledge and truth and evidence, or what we see as knowledge, truth, and evidence. Because what's happening in the research world and in the teaching world is that we reward researchers or academics who are able to reach what we call statistical significance, meaning that you have proved something with a large number of people that are all the same. And that allows you to publish, that allows you then to get research funding, and it allows you to get what we call tenure, which is sort of what every professor wants. That means that you can work at a university for life and do research what you want to research. But if you are trying to research out at that edge, then you're not going to ever reach statistical significance, so you won't publish, you won't get tenure, you won't get funding, and it becomes much more difficult to pursue that knowledge. So we have this huge knowledge gap out there as well. And education isn't designed, because education is ranking and rating according to that middle. If you're not like the middle, then you won't get the marks, etc. I can go on to work, it affects work. It even affects how we vote and who we bring into office. Because, of course, it's one person, one vote. And the majority is likely to be more concerned about the potholes in front of their driveway than they are about the critical services that will make a child's life valuable and effective and purposeful and less lonely. So when we gather up the votes, there is a disparity as well. And don't worry, I am going to go back up. The thing that is most distressing to me is that the way that we address that 20% is also somewhat counterproductive, because even in the accessibility field, in our accessibility laws and in our approaches to addressing the needs of the people that are out in that periphery, we either address the needs as an afterthought or bolt on after the fact. We segregate and specialize the way that we do things, and that really doesn't work in the digital world. Or we create another high incidence disability group, and then, of course, other people are left out. But this pattern doesn't just damage the individuals that are out at the periphery or that have needs out at the periphery. It also damages our whole society, because what it has resulted in is mass production, meaning we manufacture all sorts of things we don't need and then throw them away, and that isn't very good for the world. It results in mass communication, which means that there's a lot of misleading information and reduced information that is oversimplified. It leads to mass marketing, which means we buy things we don't really need. And it creates a popularity push where popularity rules as opposed to things that are valuable. And most of all, we lose out in terms of innovation. There is greater conformance, lock-in, we reduce flexibility, extensibility, and room to move, resilience and resourcefulness. And of course, the one lesson that many people who are in that middle don't understand is that you can fall out of that middle anytime when you least expect it, and that's probably the one rule that governs all our lives. At some point in our life, we will be out there in the periphery. So what I wanted to do with this alarm was to send the alarm and say, before we automate and amplify using our power tools of AI, let's re-examine how we attain knowledge and how we develop intelligence. And I have a very good friend, Ursula Franklin, who unfortunately died a few years ago, who says that technology involves organization, procedures, symbols, new words, equations, and most of all, a mindset. And another piece of wisdom she gave me is that it's easier to move on from the things, but it's harder to get rid of the ideas. And so this took me down a rabbit hole of about 200 years or so. I wanted to figure out, where did these ideas come from? And how are we going to tackle these ideas? And for those of you who are computer buffs or whatever, it took me to the first wave of big data. And the first wave of big data was, can anybody guess how many years ago that was? It was about 220 years ago, when demographers, those are people that count and measure people, decided that they were going to count and measure people, and the reason they were going to do that was because there were a lot of armies forming, and it was the industrial era, and we needed replaceable workers, and we needed replaceable soldiers. And so they started to document how we would measure people and how we would classify people and find those replaceable workers and replaceable soldiers. And there were 4 influential innovators. There's these 4 men that came up with what were then considered brilliant ideas, because what they were trying to do was find answers to how do we bring order out of chaos, how do we tame diversity and complexity, and how do we achieve efficiency. The first, which Pamela will be familiar with, was Adolphe Quetelet. And he was an astronomer, and he thought, oh my gosh, there's lovely laws that happen regarding the stars. We can mathematically determine how the stars are going to move, how the world moves. Let's use that same mathematics on people. And so he invented the average man. And he decided that the individual, anything that wasn't average, was synonymous with error. So if you were average, you were right. If you were not average, you were wrong. The average person, he said, represents the true human being. And he said all sorts of really horrible things about what would happen or what was wrong with not being average or not being typical. And I won't read them because they're pretty horrible and scary. But this led to the demonizing of diversity and the valorizing of conformity, meaning that they celebrated when you were conforming or exactly like the average. And of course this helped with what I was saying, the military strategy, and creating factories where you needed workers that were exactly the same, and you could simply replace them. And it started a whole movement to tame inconvenient human variability. And this is a large part of where camps and madhouses and penal systems and our schooling system that we still use in most schools came from. And of course, genocide as well. The next person that was there at the time was Charles Darwin. So he was there at the same time as Kelly. And what he invented, or what he discovered, or what he initially articulated was something called natural selection, or survival of the fittest, where there are winners and losers in evolution. But being fair to Darwin, he didn't actually stress that. That's what we took from it, and that's what we have called Darwinism, which is to some extent a misnomer, because in fact what he was talking about was fitness, was adaptation, the ability to change and to adapt. And diversification and variability was his main interest, but we grabbed onto that survival of the fittest. The strong shall survive, and the strong are the ones that are going to evolve, which if you think about dinosaurs and strength is not really the right formula. The next person that was there was someone named Vilfredo Pareto, and he created something that's called the Pareto principle. And if any of you are taking a business school, or you are going into economics, you'll have heard about what's called the 80-20 principle. And remember that starburst that I was talking about? Basically, he recognized that starburst, and he said, oh, we can use this starburst. There's a magic formula here, that those 20% or that the 80 people that are in 20% of the space, right in that middle, are the ones you should focus on, and forget the difficult 20% that are out at the periphery. So Richard Koch was someone who amplified that idea, or made it an even more popular idea. He called it the magic formula, the quick win, the low-hanging fruit, how to beat the system, the way to make easy profit. Just ignore those difficult 20% out at the edge, because they require 80% of the effort. Concentrate on the 80% that are in the middle. And so he told every business and every designer, ignore the 20%, work towards the 80%. The last person that was there, the fourth of those four white men, was Melvil Dewey. And I didn't spell Melville, for those of you who've been spelling bees. Melvil is also not to be confused with a really great person called John Dewey, who changed education. But Melvil was the one, if anyone's ever gone to the library, Melvil created the classification system, how we classify books or topics in a library. So it's called the Dewey Decimal System. And what he was trying to do was to bring about order, standardization, control. He wanted to stamp out efficiency, inefficiency and uncertainty. And in fact, he was so determined to stamp out inefficiency that he decided that his name was inefficient. And so he changed Dewey, D-E-W-E-Y, to D-U-I, because that saved on the letters. And the unfortunate thing about Dewey was he was very, very biased. And his personal biases went into the classification system. He was very racist. He was very homophobic. He objectified women even before the Me Too movement that we have now. He had 7 suits against him because of the way he treated women at the time, which, when you think about this, 220 years ago, he must have been pretty bad. And he had he had a religious bias again, as well. So if you go to the Dewey Decimal System and you look at the classifications, you should take a look at how things are classified. So all of these, the ideas of these 4 men, I discovered, are entangled in our mindset. They've become fundamental principles. They're inextricably enmeshed in how we view the world. How many times today have you said typical, average, normal? How many times have you said the best, or the priority, or the winning choice, or those sorts of things? All of us use those words all the time. All of us use those ideas all the time. They've shaped our education, our business, our markets, everything. Now, another person at the time was James Russell Lowell. Sorry, I'm having a hard time pronouncing names today. And he said, "For only through unlearning wisdom comes." And so I took up the journey of trying to look at rethinking these ideas. So in terms of Darwin's ideas, what I discovered is that there are scientists out there who are proving that it's not survival of the fittest, but what's called relaxed selection, natural selection, that allows humanity to move and to learn new things and to grow. What that means is it's not when the strong are killing the weak, but in fact when there is an opportunity for as many different diverse species to be there, that humanity moves forward. There is a man called Terence Deacon, and what he proved was that if we had only survival of the fittest, then we would never have developed language. It was because we had the choice, and there wasn't the strong killing the weak, that we in fact had the emergence of language. Diversification, meaning a number of many choices, and a diversity of option, frees us from this zero-sum game. We don't need a winning choice. We don't need to know what is best. We don't need to scale by replicating. We can scale by diversifying. And scaling meaning grow and replicate. And we can compete with ourselves to become fitter or more adaptable, rather than competing with each other. Regarding Pareto's principle, it was actually misinterpreted, because one of the things where Pareto's idea came from is he recognized that about 20% of the Italian population owned 80% of the land. And so what he told the emperor was, ignore the 80%, just worry about the 20%, because they have the power and they hold the influence. If you want to get re-elected or whatever, then just simply think about those 20% that own most of the land. He called them the vital few, as opposed to the difficult many, or not difficult many, the difficult few. He called them the vital few instead of the difficult few, sorry. But I wanted to examine who are the current vital few. If our goal is not greed, quick wins, or gaming the system, but innovation, diverse perspectives, which of course breed innovation, and detecting the weak signals, because those, what we call the weak signals, are the first signs that something very big is going to happen that's going to disrupt our life. The difficult 20%, or what Richard Koch had called the difficult 20%, those people out at the periphery, occupy about 80% of the unoccupied terrain, meaning they have the knowledge of the terrain that other people who are average and typical and in the middle haven't experienced. And so they are actually the vital few. And they help in something that another man currently, Scott Page, calls the diversity bonus. And he's discovered that teams with diverse perspectives are better than homogenous teams of the best and the brightest. If you put the best and the brightest in one room and they have to solve a problem, and you put the most diverse group possible in another room and they have to solve the same problem, guess who's going to solve the problem first, predict better, and come up with more creative ideas? It's not the best and brightest. It's the group that has the most diverse perspectives. And in terms of Quetelet's invention, we've discovered there isn't any average. And there's a book by Todd Rose, which shows that, in fact, and he tells a story of the fighter pilot jets that were designed for the average. And when they actually discovered that that didn't work very well, they tested to see, is there anyone that is in fact average, that measures exactly as the average person that this was modeled on. They discovered there's no one at all, anywhere, that fits that average. And what we also discovered is how we determine truth is actually a distortion and a reduction of truth. So the standard that we researchers and academics have been using as the ideal way to discover things, the statistical significance, etc., is really reducing and getting rid of a lot of the truth. We equate evidence with majority, repeatability, and probability. But if you're not like the average, probability is wrong. So we equate impact with a single measure for a large homogeneous number. But we are heterogeneous, meaning that we're all very different and we're unalike. And we need different measures. And unfortunately, the evidence that people are using has crept its way into how we make government decisions as well. And so it's very important to figure out a different way of determining and measuring impact and measuring evidence. Dewey's classification as well is a problem. Classification fails to do justice to at least some dimensions of that which is classified, which can have serious ethical, economic, political, and other consequences. Basically mean don't put people into categories because it doesn't work. Sorry.
I would like to hold up all the green carrots.
So, sorting into categories, there are alternatives, and we have many alternatives, and I won't get into the technical issues with that. So, I tried to move from a hopeful optimist to alarmed optimist, and hopefully back again. And I started to look at all of the values that we have, and I discovered as well that many of those values have sort of been co-opted and perverted. And we talk about friendship, connection, sharing, news, watching out for each other, community, personalization, and all of those have sort of been taken over as terms to justify things that are none of those things. I mean, how many friends do you have on Facebook, and are they actually your friends? There are sharing platforms which actually extract the value from the workers, so the workers have very little don't actually share in the value. And I could go on. There are many concerning things. So how do we restate those values? How do we reclaim them? The biggest truth to know is difference is our asset. It's not our deficit. The difficult 20% are experts in complexity. So if we have difficulty in dealing with diversity and complexity, this is the area that we need to worry about. Because out in that terrain is where we find innovation, where we find the weak signals that are going to prepare us for the chaotic and complex future. And if we make room for that middle to move and change by designing right out to the edge, it benefits everyone. And the one thing that I've been saying since we've been celebrating the moonshot, the Apollo moonshot, well, wait a sec, there's a huge territory that we haven't explored here. It's that outer edge of that human starburst. Pamela was talking about definitions of disability. So one of the definitions that we use, because I'm talking to designers, is I view disability as a mismatch. It's not a personal trait, it's not a permanent thing unless you choose it as your identity and it's part of your culture. But we see disability as a mismatch between the needs of the person and the product, service, or environment. And so it's our responsibility to design things, environments, policies, and services in such a way that they don't disable. And we have what are called the 3 dimensions of inclusive design. Most of you are probably familiar with universal design, and there are 7 principles of universal design. And everybody kept saying, well, what are the 7 principles of inclusive design? And because it was relative and it depends on the person, the goal, and their context, I was sort of resisting creating this checklist of what you need to achieve. And so I came up with the 3 dimensions of inclusive design. The first is we're all unique, we're all different, and we need to understand that difference ourselves, and we need to gain the knowledge about that difference and how to make things work for ourselves. So don't just make machines smarter, make people smarter about what they need and how they can advocate for themselves. The second is create an inclusive process. So we don't design for, we design with. We definitely follow the nothing about us without us. And we constantly look at what does our table look like before we invite people to the table. We actually don't want to just invite people to the table. We want people to come and create the table with us and to keep refining the table and fixing the table and making it more welcoming and making it their own. We try to bring in as diverse a group of people as possible. And then we want to also think about the whole, the system, because we want whatever we design to work not just for one person, or not just those 80% that occupy the 20% of the space, but for everyone. So we move from a notion of one size fits all to one size fits one in a system, because policies, services, computer systems, most things can flex and adapt and change in a way that whoever is coming there, it fits their requirements. And I don't have time, if you're interested, I can show you a bunch of these tomorrow during the workshop, ways in which we're doing this. How we evolve and innovate depends on bringing in those individuals or designing with people that are out in that 80% of the terrain. And if you're interested in all of the examples where that's the case, there is someone that has studied innovations over the last century or so, 2 centuries, actually ever since those 4 men decided on those wonderful ideas. What we've discovered is we would be without the typewriter, the telephone, the transistor radio, the computer, even email, talking books, speech recognition, optical character recognition. If we didn't design with people who are out at that outer edge, none of these would have happened. I'll just pick one story out of here. They're all amazing stories. But Vint Cerf is now the senior scientist at Google, and he invented email, which, how many of you use email? He invented email because he wanted to communicate with his wife who was deaf, and he was also hard of hearing. The typewriter, which is, you all have keyboards probably at some point or another, someone was having an affair with a woman who was deaf and blind and wanted a way to communicate with her Tory. So on the slide without her assistants reading it, and that's how the typewriter came about. There are many stories like that. Yesterday we had a workshop, and somebody came up with this particular, who was it that first found or mentioned this? Someone, anyways. This is a popular cartoon which shows someone shoveling the steps, and someone asks, could you please shovel the ramp? All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you, is what the guy says who's shoveling the ramp. But the very smart kid says, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. And that's a lesson that we learn again and again. If you design for the edge, if you go out to that edge, it benefits everyone. So Pamela was talking about engaging community, and the way that we've been trying out to engage community is to provide a purpose, to address a problem together, and to provide people with meaning. And we found that that works really well. In fact, we have people who we don't pay, who work for large companies who receive a perk by just spending a few months with us and helping us program, because what we're doing is much more meaningful and purposeful than what they're doing when they're creating advertisements or other systems of code. We also don't seek perfection, but we've learned the magic of the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete, and this is called wabi-sabi. It's actually a Japanese aesthetic, but it works really well for learning, because the incomplete invites completion, the broken invites fixing, and mistakes invite correction. You're much more likely to get somebody to get engaged if you're not perfect and if you don't have a notion of best or standard. We also ask why a lot, and we have this game that we use whenever we think we've settled on a brilliant design, or whenever we're trying to seek an approach to something. We do what we call the toddler-grandparent conversation. We continue. Does anybody have toddlers? There are a few toddlers here, but at one point they keep asking why. I mean, a lot of kids do that, right? And it can be infuriating, but it's a lovely exercise to keep thinking about, well, why exactly are we doing this? And pulling out our perspective. And most of all, we don't invite people into the system that is not made with them. And this, of course, is how a lot of accessibility and HR equity and all of those things come about. You say, oh yes, we're going to hire people with disabilities, but in fact, you're hiring someone into a system that was never made with the intention of, or that wasn't made for them. And so every working day is a friction, and it becomes harder and harder to do your job. But one thing regarding Jean Beignet and his rabbit and giraffe story, one of the things we're doing in addition to acting like a rabbit is, and I'm still thinking about this, so I'm not necessarily committed to this, but I think to some extent sometimes we ask the rabbit to ride the giraffe, or the giraffe to give the rabbit a ride, because we want the long view, we want the whole view. We want to have bottom up and looking at the whole. And one of our teachers there is Dana Meadows, or Danilo Meadows, and she talks about thinking in systems. And don't worry, you don't need to read all this, I'm not going to read all this, but look up Dana Meadows. Some takeaways are: never fear trying something new and failing, avoid false binaries, pass or fail, win or best or not best or worst. There is no stasis, only balance, and continuously reevaluate new rules or policies or the sacred in terms of the strategies that you're using. Not to say there isn't sacred stuff, but what you're planning and what your plans are not necessarily sacred. And so you all know all this already, right? But there's one other lesson that Dana Meadows taught us, and this is what's called the Cobra effect. And the Cobra effect is, I'll tell you one quick story, and then we'll quickly wrap up. So the Cobra effect came about, it was labeled by another one of those economists back about, actually not quite 200 years, a few years back. And he tells a story of Delhi in India, where the British colonialists, the British who were ruling at the time, decided there were too many cobras in the city. And so they said, okay, how do we get rid of cobras? Let's figure out a good plan that would get rid of the cobras. And what they decided to do was to create a bounty. That means for every cobra you bring in, you get some money. And so the enterprising Indians in Delhi decided, here's a way to make money. So they created cobra farms. And they bred cobras. So the British were getting all these cobras brought in, and they thought, our plan is working. Look at our metrics. Look at our impact. We have huge numbers of cobras coming in. We must be effective. when they discovered what was actually happening, they decided, oh dear, we'll cancel the bounty. And of course, the Indians decided, well, these cobras are no use to us, and so they let them go. So it was an unintended consequence of not really thinking about the whole, or not including everybody in that decision-making. And what we've discovered is that the same thing, unfortunately, is happening with a lot of our accessibility laws. We're not really including the edges. And one of the things that I've discovered, especially in areas where there's certification or where we declare that a business is the best. So I had an experience with a friend of mine who needed something from a service, and this service was certified 5 stars, fully compliant. There was big news articles about how lovely and wonderful they were in terms of accessibility. But when I went with my friend to ask for something that was quite reasonable to make it accessible, they said, wait a sec, we have 5 stars. We've done everything. We've spent $50,000 in making our business accessible. If you still can't use it, it must be your problem. And so one of the things that I'm finding is that there are people that are falling through the cracks or stranded at the edges. And we talked a little bit about cost yesterday, or I've heard cost coming up a lot, that this is an objection. But one of the things we've discovered is that it actually costs less if you think about the edge right from the beginning. We compared a whole bunch of services, government services and businesses that were designed so that everybody was included right from the beginning. Well, it did cost a little bit more at the beginning. It did take a little bit more time. But that service survived because it could adapt, and there weren't that many problems with fitting new changes in context, because the world changes. And so those plans had much greater longevity. But if you only plan for those 80% that take the 20% of the space, then lots of people come and say, wait, I don't understand it. It doesn't work. Fix it for me. And so you continuously hack. And what happens is it starts to become this patchwork. And you need more training, you need more maintenance, and the system quickly breaks down. So how we plan is what we call our virtuous tornado. If you look at many business plans or design thinking, what happens is they create a design, they think about all sorts of ideas, and then they winnow it down, meaning they eliminate a lot of ideas until they come up with the one best idea. And most of the planning cycles look like that, or they look like marching up a series of steps to building a wall out of bricks. But what we use is we continuously iterate, meaning we repeat and try again and try again and try again and test with everybody until we stretch our design to encompass as many needs as possible. And we even have a map for that, where we look at what are the needs that our design currently achieves within that starburst, and how far to the edge are we getting, and where is the gap. I have, how much time do I have left?
10 minutes or so?
5 actually.
5,
Maybe 7 if we're being generous.
Okay, can you be generous? Well, actually, ask me about privacy and data protection and data vulnerability afterwards, but we've been working on a strategy for that. Because how many of you read all of the legalese before you click I agree? Oh, we do, okay. Well, most people don't, and they're not aware of what happens with all of your data. But lastly, because I do want time for questions. We have a different approach to education as well. We have a different approach to the future of work. But one silver lining, and I want to end with optimism, regarding the story of my friend who was in the intersection, was that all of a sudden, all those hard scientists, or all of those boards and people who used to poo-poo whenever I talked about bias, or equity, or compassion, or empathy, or any of the values that you have here, they would dismiss them as, oh, they're not hard science. All of a sudden they're listening because it affects how our artificial intelligence systems are running and many things that our automated machines are doing. And there is a movement at the moment. This is an article that was submitted to Nature, which is the pinnacle of publishing. It's the highest impact journal, where scientists are starting to recognize that a lot of what we're doing in terms of privileging or making the average more important than the whole is a bad thing. And I have I've got a strategy for the artificial intelligence systems, which I'm calling my lawnmower of justice. So if there's any, basically what I'm doing at the moment, the middle overwhelms the edges. But if you cut off the top of that, what is called the bell curve, and you have the machine attend to the entire spread of diverse needs, then it actually becomes more intelligent. And we have a project that we call Project We Count, which I call my Horton Here's a Who project, where we're trying to address the data gaps that are missing and the issues that have not been addressed. And a bunch of people yesterday joined me as researchers in that. So just to conclude, intelligence, education, design that understands, recognizes, and serves diversity, and especially that outer edge, is better able to respond to the unexpected, detect risk, adapt to change, transfer to new contexts. It provides greater longevity. It may reduce disparity. And this is, I think, a gift that you all can give to the world, because you understand these things already. And all of those boardrooms and professors don't quite understand the principles of actually respecting diversity, giving dignity to that edge, and designing to the edge. So I think you have the opportunity to lift us out of many of the ruts that we're currently in. We just need to collectively figure out how we can make the rest of the world understand this. So I would love your help in doing that. And because I'm a professor, I can't resist. Here's a bunch of books. And I will share those. I'll share the slides so you have the books. But you can also take pictures if you want. And I'd love to continue the conversation.
I have a question. Oh my God, too many questions. But one question is, it's extremely difficult to change minds. You've been doing this work since 1993, and I can feel that middle part you're talking about, or the alarming part of changing the minds of people who are set in the ways of diversity is not. And how do you approach, or how have you seen some of the change happen? How do you approach those difficult situations?
Yeah, so my team always says, Jutta's answer to everything is diversity. There's as many different strategies as possible. The breakthroughs have happened actually, unfortunately, when something goes wrong out there. There's a Hillary Clinton quote, "Never waste a good crisis." So what we tend to do is when something goes wrong, we come and say, well, and we don't go and say, we told you so. We say, well, something has gone wrong. Let's figure out a different way. That's when people are most open to a different way. So that what I noticed with the automated vehicles, I predicted that this would happen when they tried it out. And actually, the Uber accident where an Uber automated vehicle ran over a woman who was pushing her bicycle across the road was exactly the pattern that I had predicted. And so when that happened, and people started searching, well, who has been looking at this sort of thing, all of a sudden I got hundreds of invitations to come speak to scientists who would never have given me the time of day before. So all of a sudden I'm traveling all over the place and talking to groups of people. So that, but I'm not saying that that's the only way. The other way is that what I was talking about, where we're inviting programmers in. So we've been, or I trained 10,000 Microsoft people in inclusive design because the company was not doing very well, their PR was tanking, and many people still considered them the evil empire. And so they wanted a way to make themselves look better, and they started with that as their only motive. But once we had our wedge in, or what I call my virtuous Trojan horse into there, they recognized, oh my God, there are other benefits to this. And so at the end, it ended in training 10,000 Microsoft employees. And if you look at the Super Bowl advertisement that Microsoft made about the Xbox, that's one of the things that happened because of that tiny wedge. But we're also welcoming programmers from many of the large companies that are creating these huge things. They see it as a perk to come and work with us. And once they come and help us and work with us and see something meaningful and purposeful, then they go back out. I'm also trying to infuse it into, actually one thing that we did that was really, really smart in the 80s is we gave away all our software. So you all, I can say without a doubt, if you have a computer, if you have a smartphone, you have some of our code. It's in there because the companies took it because we gave it away, and they put it in their operating systems. And now, because it's in the foundations and they can't take it out, they have to help us maintain it and keep it going and grow. So most of our code in our open source projects comes not from us. We don't pay for the coders. It comes from other people who are actually in the large companies. There's lots of other, not quite so devious strategies, but it's diverse. I mean, diverse. Try whatever you can. Right, is what we're doing.
Question back there.
Yeah.
You answered one of my questions, which is about programmers who are controlling the AI. They're the key, and they're usually white men in their 20s to 30s. That's part of the problem. But I had a question about privacy, because a question comes up, about once a year on my list for website accessibility, where people say, hey, we should track people with disabilities in our statistics. So if you're using a specific software because you're blind, geez, we want to track that so that we can try to see what you're using and make the site better. But in fact, then other people say, well, no, that's just going to track that you had one person who's blind that's come to your website in the last year, and that's going to make people not make the websites accessible, right? Because they say, well, that's just one person. So that comes into privacy issues as well. So I wonder if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of skipped over we're doing a bunch of stuff about this data impasse, because so what those data scientists out there are worried about is that in order for them to create intelligent systems, they need data, but people don't trust them with their data anymore because we have obvious, very, very rational concerns about what's going to happen with our data. I mean, most of us are giving away our data all the time. The minute you click on a link, the minute you press like, or you open a Facebook page, or you link to somebody. So unconsciously, automatically, we're giving away our data. One of the alarming things we found is that there is what's called privacy by design. It's a way to protect people and their private data. But if you are an outlier, if you're unlike anyone else, it's very, very easy to break that, because the primary strategy is what's called anonymization at source, meaning you take away the name and the identity of the data and keep the information of the data. But if you are the only person ordering colostomy bags in your neighborhood, then you will be re-identified. It's very easy to figure out who you are. So the privacy stuff doesn't really work. So we're trying to figure out ways of allowing people to have control of their own data. And there's a bunch of strategies. One is we are creating what we call a personal data preference standard, where you decide, this is who I trust with this piece of information under these conditions for this length of time. And then whoever wants to use your data has to declare what piece of data is essential in a way that can be questioned and looked at by anyone. It has to be transparent and auditable. And then it becomes a negotiation, and you decide, is it worth giving away this piece of data to this company, rather than just clicking I agree all the time. We've also created something called data platform co-ops, and this was started in France, where there were a number of people that had rare illnesses, and they recognized that the health system wasn't really it had no research about their rare illnesses, and yet they were also vulnerable to insurance companies denying them insurance if they figured out that they had these rare illnesses. So they created a platform called Me Data, where they collected their own data, and they invited researchers in, and they determined, so they owned and they gained from the value of their own data. It's now expanded, and we're trying to see how can we use it in our communities as well, with our vulnerable data. But there's much more to say than that. But I don't know if I've completely answered your question yet, but I can talk more. But I'm seeing that it's time.
We can hold your attention for just a couple more minutes. I'm sure, I know that there were many other questions. I'm sorry we couldn't access them. Our generosity only goes so far. And people need to have a break. So, Jutta is here the rest of the week. I'm sure she's happy to answer every single question that is on your mind, as long as it doesn't take more than a few minutes at a time, right?
And I have a workshop tomorrow morning.
Oh, there is a workshop tomorrow morning as well that you can attend with additional information. So before you leave the stage,
thank you very much. This is a nice token for you. Okay. I'll pay for you tonight, and pay for you tonight, pay for you. Good friend, thank you for you. Good job, good speech. So I miss you. You know, once I can just take it for you. Okay?